All right, strap yourselves in because today we're going deep on a topic that just might flip your whole understanding of modern warfare on its head. Drones. Yeah, I've got a whole stack of your sources right here.
Oh.
And we're ready to unpack everything. From those kind of grainy videos we all see on the news to the moral questions that give even a hardened general pause.
You know, it really is fascinating how we kind of tend to think of drones as this like super modern technology. But you know, when you really dig into it, their roots actually go back like way back over a century. We're talking World War I here. It almost seems unbelievable. But that war, as brutal as it was, actually sparked those first serious attempts at what some people would call ethical warfare.
Ethical warfare. I mean,
Yeah.
that sounds kind of almost like an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you think about all the horrors of that war. Like,
Right.
what were they thinking?
Well, you got to imagine the public outcry at the just.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of the casualties, millions dead, entire generations just wiped out. People were desperate for any way to make war, well, less deadly. And that's where we start to see this idea emerge, the idea of attacking things, not people.
Okay, so instead of targeting like soldiers in the trenches, the thinking was to go after like factories, supply lines, infrastructure, basically the things that were fueling the whole war machine.
Exactly. And that's where we see the first glimmers of this idea of precision bombing, this dream of being able to just surgically strike the enemy's ability to wage war while, minimizing civilian casualties. Now, of course, the technology back then was nowhere near sophisticated enough to actually achieve that level of accuracy.
Right. And that brings us to the Kettering bug, right? Yeah, I read about that in one of the articles you sent. It's just wild to think about the very first attempt at a drone. I mean, a pilotless plane. In 1917.
It truly was an engineering marvel for its time. They called it a flying bomb sometimes. It was supposed to take off, fly this pre-programmed route, and then crash into the target, all without a pilot on board. They even called it an aerial torpedo.
Sounds pretty innovative, at least in theory. But did it actually work?
Well, let's just say it was a bit more bug than bomb. It was notoriously unreliable, sometimes veering way off course, sometimes even attacking its own side. Not exactly the precision they were hoping for.
Yikes. Talk about friendly fire.
Yeah.
So the Kettering bug, it was more of a historical footnote than a real game changer.
Right.
But it did kind of set the stage for future developments in a way.
Absolutely. It proved that the basic concept of a pilotless aircraft was possible, even if the technology wasn't quite there yet. And that idea of precision bombing, that remained this really tantalizing goal for military strategists.
Right. And speaking of precision bombing, that leads us to another invention that kept popping up in your research, the Norden bomb sight, developed just in time for World War II. This thing was like a huge leap forward in terms of accuracy.
Yeah, it really was. It was like an early analog computer, this marvel of gears and calculations, helping pilots drop bombs with incredible accuracy, suddenly. Pinpoint attacks on specific targets became a reality, not just a dream anymore, at least in theory.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Indeed. While the Norden bomb sight did allow for much greater precision, it also kind of led to this subtle but really profound shift in thinking. Instead of just trying to avoid civilians, the focus kind of shifted towards maximizing destruction of military targets, even if that meant accepting some level of collateral damage.
So the quest for precision, in a way, it kind of backfired.
Yeah.
Because it made it easier to justify bombing campaigns that caused, widespread devastation, even if they were technically more accurate.
It's a really complex issue, and one that historians are still debating today. But the Norden bomb sight definitely played a role in shaping the strategic thinking of World War II. And this tension between precision and destruction, between this desire to limit warfare and the reality of its horrors.
Yeah.
Well, that's a thread that runs through the entire history of drones.
That's a great point. And that brings us to the next chapter in our drone saga, the Vietnam War. And that's where we see the emergence of the lightning bug. A drone so small, it could practically fit in your backpack.
It was such a stark contrast to that lumbering Kettering bug. The lightning bug was designed to be nimble, disposable, and incredibly versatile. It was mainly used for reconnaissance, capturing images of enemy positions and relaying them back to command.
So basically a spy in the sky. This tiny little drone risking its, non-existent neck to gather intel.
Yeah, you could say that. But they were also used as decoys to draw enemy fire and even to guide missiles to their targets. Talk about a multitasking machine.
It's amazing how much they packed into such a small package. But it seems like at this point, drones were still playing a supporting role in warfare. When did they make that leap from spy to, something more lethal?
Well, that transition really starts to take shape during the first Gulf War, a conflict that a lot of people see as a turning point in modern warfare. Drones were still primarily used for reconnaissance and missile guidance, but there was this growing awareness of their potential for something
Yeah.
more.
More? You mean,
Imagine taking those eyes in the sky, those drones that were so good at gathering information,
Mm.
and adding teeth. That idea of combining surveillance and striking capabilities, that's when things start to get really interesting.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. This is like a technological thriller unfolding.
Yeah.
But before we jump into the modern drone era, let's take a quick break to recharge. We'll be right back with more of your deep dive. Exploring the evolution of drone warfare from spy in the sky to, well,
Yeah.
let's just say things get a bit more complicated. Don't touch that dial. All right, we're back and ready to keep diving deep into the history of drone warfare. Last time, after we left off, right on the verge of this major shift. Drones going from mostly just reconnaissance to something much more potent.
And that shift really kicks into high gear with this drone I'm sure you've heard of. The MQ-1A Predator. It saw its first action in Afghanistan back in 2001, just weeks after 9/11. And its very first mission was a high-stakes one. They wanted to take out the Taliban leader, Mullah Omar.
So no more just gathering intel. This was about actively hunting and eliminating targets. Did they get him?
Well, that mission to take out Omar actually failed. But even so, having the Predator in Afghanistan, that marked a real turning point. It showed everyone what drones could do, not just find targets, but actually strike them with deadly force from thousands of miles away.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around it. Sitting in a control room, moving a joystick, and launching missiles at people on the other side of the planet. It just feels so disconnected from the realities of war.
That disconnect, that distance, that's one of the things that makes drone warfare so ethically complex, brings up all these big questions about accountability, the nature of combat itself, and even the psychological toll on both the people operating the drones and the people living under their constant threat.
You mentioned the people living under drones. One of the articles you sent, it really stuck with me. It talked about what it's like to live in a place like Yemen or Pakistan, where just hearing a drone overhead could mean you're about to die.
Yeah. Imagine living with that kind of fear, that constant uncertainty of the sky, instead of being something beautiful, becomes a source of potential threat. That's the reality for millions of people, and it's one of the hidden costs of this kind of warfare.
And then there's the whole issue of accuracy, of civilian casualties.
Yeah.
How can we even know the real cost of these strikes when the information is so often classified or disputed?
That lack of transparency is a huge concern. The U.S. government keeps such tight control over information about drone strikes that it makes it almost impossible to get a clear picture of the impact on civilians. Some independent organizations have tried to track casualties, but their estimates are all over the place, ranging from hundreds to thousands.
It's almost like we're fighting this war in the shadows, where the true costs are hidden from view.
Exactly, and that secrecy makes it even harder to have any kind of meaningful debate about the ethics of it all. How can we weigh the proportionality of force, the justification for targeted killings, if we don't even know the consequences?
It's a pretty disturbing thought. And this brings us to the Obama presidency. He really embraced drone warfare as a key tool in the fight against terrorism. He saw it as a way to achieve military objectives without putting American troops at risk.
And under his administration, the use of drones absolutely skyrocketed. The number of strikes, especially in places like Pakistan and Yemen, went way up. Obama's argument was that drone strikes were more precise and less risky than traditional military operations.
There was a lot of controversy too, right?
Yeah.
Especially around the idea of signature strikes.
Oh, yeah. Signature strikes were definitely a controversial part of Obama's drone policy. These were strikes that targeted people, not because of who they were, but because of how they were acting or patterns in their activity. It's like targeting someone based on their signature instead of their name.
So instead of going after a known terrorist leader, they might target someone who just fit a certain profile, like someone who was seen near a suspected training camp or handling weapons. That sounds incredibly risky.
It was. Critics argued that signature strikes relied on weak intelligence and often led to the deaths of innocent civilians, and the lack of transparency around them made it impossible to know how effective they really were, or to hold anyone accountable for mistakes.
It feels like we're wading into some really murky ethical waters here, and that feeling gets even stronger when you consider that Obama's administration even authorized drone strikes against American citizens.
Yeah, the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American-born cleric with ties to al-Qaeda, was a really controversial decision. It raised huge questions. about due process,
Yeah.
the right to a fair trial, and the limits of executive power. The fact that he was killed without ever being charged with a crime, well, it sparked a huge debate about the legality and morality of targeted killings.
A debate that's still going on today. And it's a debate that got even more complicated with the actions of President Trump, who took drone warfare in a whole new direction. But before we get into that, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
We've seen how this quest for precision in warfare, something that started over a century ago, has led to these incredibly sophisticated weapons that can kill from across the world. But we've also seen how this technology has brought up all these profound ethical questions, questions that we as a society are still wrestling with.
We've gone from clumsy flying bombs to these sleek remote-controlled killing machines. And the pace of technology, it's not slowing down. So what does the future hold for drone warfare? And what does it mean for humanity? Those are the questions we'll be exploring as we continue our deep dive. Stay with us. Okay, so we've been tracing this evolution of drone warfare, right, from those early kind of clunky beginnings to their, sort of coming of age in Afghanistan and Iraq and right up through the Obama years with all those moral questions they raised. But the story doesn't end there, right? The Trump administration, they took drone warfare in a whole other direction, didn't they?
Yeah, President Trump relaxed a lot of the rules around drone strikes, and that led to a big jump in how much they were used, especially in countries like Somalia and Yemen. And he also gave more power to military commanders out in the field. Basically, they had a lot more freedom to decide when and where to launch a strike.
So less oversight, less scrutiny of each individual strike. Did that lead to more civilian casualties?
That's really tough to say for sure. The data on civilian casualties from drone strikes, it's always kind of spotty and disputed. But human rights groups, they've said they're worried that using more drones with less oversight, well, it probably means more civilian deaths.
That's a heavy thought. And then there was the targeted killing of General Qasem Soleimani back in 2020. That sent shockwaves around the world. That was a huge escalation, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a really bold and controversial move. Killing Soleimani, a top military leader of another country, it raised all these serious questions about international law and what kind of precedent it set for future conflicts. Some people said it was self-defense. Others called it an illegal assassination.
It feels like we're in this whole new era of warfare now where drones aren't just for counterterrorism anymore. They could be a major weapon in wars between countries. What does that even mean for the future?
That's the question that keeps a lot of experts up at night. As drone technology keeps getting better and easier to get, it's not hard to imagine a future where drones are right at the center of wars between nations, not just skirmishes with smaller groups. And that opens up a whole new can of worms ethically and legally.
It's kind of a terrifying thought. Speaking of terrifying thoughts, one of the articles you sent talked about the rise of autonomous drones. Drones that can basically operate on their own without any human control. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It might sound like sci-fi, but it's becoming more and more real. Researchers all over the world are building drones with powerful AI capabilities. Drones that can actually make their own decisions without a human being telling them what to do.
Wait, so you're saying we're talking about drones that can pick out targets, choose their weapons, and even attack all without a human pulling the trigger? That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
There are definitely some serious concerns about what could go wrong, accidents, glitches. And there's the ethical question, too. Is it right to let machines decide who lives and who dies?
Feels like we're opening up a Pandora's box here, one that we might not be able to close once it's open. So where do we go from here? What can we even do to make sure drone warfare doesn't totally spiral out of control?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? It's a question that needs everyone at the table to answer. Policymakers, military leaders, ethicists, tech people. We need to come up with clear international rules and laws to govern how drones are used, especially these autonomous ones. And we need to make sure those rules are based on basic human values, things like accountability and respect for human life.
Sounds like a huge task,
Ah.
but a really important one. If we want to avoid a future where wars are fought by machines with no human oversight or compassion.
We can't just sit back and do nothing. The technology is changing so fast, we got to be proactive and figure out how it's developed and used. The future of war, maybe even the future of humanity, depends on it.
Well, this deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've covered a lot of ground from those first clunky attempts at building pilotless planes all the way to these super advanced autonomous drones that really make you rethink what war even is. It's a lot to take in, but it's a conversation we need to have.
It's a conversation that shouldn't stop here. We hope you'll keep exploring this topic, digging deeper into all the ethical and legal and technological sides of drone warfare. Read more, talk to people, and come to your own conclusions.
The future isn't set in stone. It's up to all of us to shape it, to make sure that technology is used to create a better world, not to destroy it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of drone warfare. It's a fascinating world, and yeah, sometimes a little scary, but we hope it's given you some things to think about.